know I can't get out of my head.
I know. No, listen.
It just doesn't stop.
There are stories that shine so brightly in the public eye that we forget the person living them. Stories that begin with hope, courage, and applause, but gradually reveal cracks. Deep, painful cracks beneath the surface. Jazz Jennings' story is one such story. She was celebrated as a pioneer, a symbol of progress for transgender visibility, a brave voice who broke barriers before she even knew what those barriers were. But as we dig deeper, we must ask, what happens when a child becomes a movement before they've even learned how to be a person? Jazz Jennings was born in 2000 in South Florida. To the world, she was initially just another bright-eyed child, with dreams and curiosities like any other. But at the age of just 2, she began expressing a truth that would not only define her life, but ignite a cultural firestorm. She would say to her parents, "I'm not a boy, I'm a girl. I'm definitely a girl." At first, her parents, Greg and Jeanette Jennings, assumed it was a phase, something their toddler might grow out of. But as time went on, it became clear that this was not a fleeting childhood moment. Jazz's tears, her frustration at being dressed in boys' clothing or being called he, were far too real and persistent to ignore. By the time she was 5, the Jennings family made a decision that very few families at that time could even imagine. They would affirm Jazz's identity, not as a phase, not as a curiosity, but as a truth. This was the early 2000s, a time when conversations about transgender children were almost non-existent. In most households, a child insisting they were a different gender would have been dismissed, punished, or forced into silence. But Greg and Jeanette Jennings chose a different path. They decided that their child's happiness, mental health, and self-expression mattered more than societal norms or the whispers of judgment from neighbors, relatives, or strangers. Jazz's social transition was, in many ways, radical for its time. She wasn't just experimenting with wearing dresses or playing with dolls. She was fully embracing a life that matched how she felt inside. She had long, flowing hair, pretty sandals, and colorful clothes that reflected her vibrant personality. At playdates and family gatherings, she proudly introduced herself as Jazz, a name she had chosen because of its lively, joyful energy. But outside the walls of her home, the Jennings family encountered a world that wasn't always ready to accept their daughter. There were schools to convince, teachers to educate, and communities to navigate. Jeanette recalls having to fight for Jazz's right to use the girls' restroom, a battle that many parents of trans kids still face today. Some parents of other children questioned whether Jazz should even be allowed to attend the same events as their daughters. The Jennings family quickly realized that they weren't just affirming their child's identity. They were stepping into a culture war they never signed up for. To make matters even more intense, Jeanette and Greg decided early on that visibility was the best way to protect Jazz. They believed that by sharing their daughter's story, they could educate the world and create a safer future for her. They started connecting with advocacy groups, speaking with medical experts, and giving interviews. And while this decision would propel Jazz into the spotlight, it also meant that her most personal journey would become public property. In 2007, a defining moment came. Jazz, then just 6 years old, appeared on ABC's 2020 in a groundbreaking interview with Barbara Walters. The segment was unlike anything the nation had ever seen. There sat a bubbly, confident little girl, speaking with wisdom far beyond her years, calmly explaining, "I'm a girl." Walters, visibly moved and perhaps stunned, listened as this young child spoke truths that many adults struggle to express. The reaction was explosive. Some viewers praised the Jennings family for their open-mindedness and unconditional love, calling them trailblazers for accepting their daughter as she was. Others, however, accused them of labeling their child too early, of pushing her into an identity before she had the maturity to truly understand herself. In that single moment, Jazz stopped being just a little girl. She became a cultural icon, a lightning rod in a growing debate about gender identity, childhood, and medical ethics. What few saw behind the cameras, though, was that this public recognition came with an invisible weight, a burden that would only grow heavier as the years passed. After that groundbreaking Barbara Walters interview, Jazz's story spread like wildfire. She became a fixture in national conversations about gender identity, celebrated by celebrities, invited onto major talk shows, and sought after by advocacy groups. For a child who just wanted to be herself, This was both empowering and overwhelming. Every smile, every candid moment, was magnified and dissected by millions. In the years following that first interview, Jazz's story exploded into mainstream media. She appeared on The Oprah Winfrey Show, was featured in countless magazine articles, and became a subject of documentaries exploring the experiences of trans youth. Her name became synonymous with the fight for transgender rights. At just 11 years old, she was already giving speeches at conferences, discussing topics that most adults find challenging to navigate. Every step of her young life was turned into an example of what courage looked like. Then came I Am Jazz, the TLC reality show that would cement her place in pop culture. The series followed her through the most vulnerable years of adolescence: school crushes, therapy sessions, medical appointments, and heart-to-heart talks with her parents. Viewers were given a front-row seat to every milestone, but also to every tear, every moment of doubt, and every crack in the polished facade. Unlike typical reality shows, I Am Jazz wasn't just entertainment. It was activism, education, and personal diary rolled into one. Behind the scenes, however, the pressure mounted. The cameras were always there. Jazz herself later admitted that she sometimes felt she was performing her identity, smiling for the audience even when she was unsure of herself. Producers wanted story arcs, dramatic moments, and neatly packaged episodes, but real life isn't always so neatly scripted. The once carefree child was now a young teenager navigating puberty, fame, and medical decisions, all while the world watched and commented. What made Jazz stand out was her warmth, intelligence, and ability to articulate her feelings so clearly, even as a child. She became a role model for thousands of young trans kids and their families. She published a children's book, did speaking tours, and was hailed as proof that transgender youth could live happy, healthy lives with the right support. But beneath the polished surface of the TV show and public appearances, cracks began to show. Being not just herself, but the symbol of trans youth, began to take an emotional toll. It wasn't just about living her truth anymore. Jazz was performing it, carrying the weight of millions of people's expectations on her young shoulders. As Jazz approached puberty, her family made another highly controversial decision. At age 11, under the care of medical professionals, she began taking puberty blockers. These medications halted the natural onset of male puberty, stopping voice deepening, facial hair growth, and other secondary sex characteristics that would conflict with her female identity. To many in the medical and activist community, this was seen as a groundbreaking step forward, a compassionate way to prevent the trauma of unwanted puberty. Yet, others raised serious concerns. Was Jazz too young to make a decision with lifelong consequences? Could an 11-year-old truly understand what it meant to medically alter her development? Soon after, Jazz began estrogen treatments to feminize her body. By the age of 14, she looked very much like a cisgender teenage girl. Her voice never deepened, her features remained soft, and her body developed in a feminine way. On the outside, she appeared confident, thriving, and happy. But privately, Jazz was recording video diary entries expressing feelings of confusion and detachment. In one heartbreaking moment captured on I Am Jazz, she admitted, "I feel like I'm living a lie. I don't feel like me." For years, the public had been told that Jazz was the perfect success story, a smiling, thriving example of early transition done right. Yet here she was, alone in front of a camera, quietly unraveling. By the time Jazz was 17, her journey was being studied by medical experts and activists worldwide. She was praised as a pioneer, someone who had paved the way for others. But in 2018, when she underwent gender confirmation surgery, reality came crashing in. Because Jazz had been on puberty blockers so early, her body hadn't developed enough tissue for the surgery to be straightforward. Her surgeons were forced to improvise, using skin grafts from her stomach to construct the vaginal canal. The operation was complicated and fraught with risks. Within days, Jazz faced severe pain, inflammation, and healing problems. What was supposed to be the final, affirming step in her journey became the start of a grueling medical ordeal. She required multiple follow-up surgeries to fix complications, each one taking a toll on her body and mind. In an interview, Jazz admitted, "I've had a lot of surgeries and I've had a lot of complications. But beyond the physical pain, it was the emotional toll that cut deepest." She began to speak openly about feeling broken, disconnected, and numb. "I feel kind of broken," she confessed, her once bright energy dimming. The world that had once celebrated her every milestone now seemed distant. Her story, which was once framed as a tale of courage and triumph, began to feel more like a cautionary tale, a reminder that medical transition, especially at a young age, is far more complex than the soundbites and headlines make it seem. After her surgery, Jazz started retreating from the public eye. Her social media activity slowed, her appearances decreased, and when she did return, she was visibly different. She had gained over 100 pounds, something she attributed to episodes of binge eating. "Food is my coping mechanism," she admitted on her show. Her mental health declined, with depression and anxiety making it hard for her to even get out of bed on some days. In one particularly emotional scene from I Am Jazz, her mother Jeanette, who had always been her fiercest advocate, broke down. "You're just saying stuff and it doesn't make sense," she pleaded with her daughter. "I just want you to love yourself. Why is that so hard?" Jazz stared ahead, silent, as millions of viewers witnessed a raw moment of despair that contrasted starkly with the early, cheerful image of Jazz as the confident young trailblazer. One of Jazz's greatest achievements came when she was accepted into Harvard University. It was a dream come true, a symbol of her intelligence and resilience. But instead of diving straight into college life, Jazz made a surprising decision. She postponed her enrollment. "I need time to heal," she said. This simple statement shattered the illusion many had of her. For years, she had been seen as unstoppable, as someone who had transitioned smoothly and come out stronger. But now, she was admitting that she wasn't okay. She needed space to figure out who she was beyond the cameras, the surgeries, and the constant public gaze. This was no longer the story of a perfect role model. It was the story of a young woman fighting to reclaim her own identity from a world that had shaped it for her. As Jazz's struggles became more visible, her story started being used in ways that were far beyond her control. Conservative commentators pointed to her depression, weight gain, and surgical complications as evidence against gender-affirming care for minors. Clips from I Am Jazz were taken out of context. Headlines blared, "Look what they did to her." Even within LGBTQ advocacy groups, Jazz's narrative became complicated. Some continued to hold her up as a pioneer, saying that her struggles only highlighted the need for more support and resources. Others quietly distanced themselves, as her reality didn't fit the neat success story that had been so heavily promoted. And through all of this, Jazz herself grew weary. "I just want to be me," she said softly in one private moment. "Not someone people debate about." But after nearly 2 decades in the spotlight, her identity had become public property, a symbol debated in classrooms, state houses, and internet forums. The Jennings family had always been portrayed as united, loving, and strong. But behind the scenes, the constant advocacy, medical decisions, and reality TV productions strained their relationships. Jeanette, Jazz's mother, had been the loudest and strongest voice, often taking on the role of both protector and manager. She arranged interviews, pushed for surgeries, and defended every choice on national television. But as Jazz's emotional struggles deepened, tensions grew. In later seasons of I Am Jazz, viewers saw moments of friction, Jeanette's frustration boiling over, Jazz's quiet sadness. Was Jeanette fighting for her daughter's well-being? Or was she fighting to maintain the narrative they had all committed to? Even the most supportive viewers began asking tough questions. Had Jazz been given the chance to grow and explore naturally, or had she been fast-tracked into adulthood because the world demanded a story of progress? To call Jazz Jennings' story tragic would be too simple. It's more complex than that. She was never just allowed to be a person. From the time she was 6, she was framed as a hero, a revolutionary, a symbol of hope for an entire community. She was everything trans advocacy groups wanted: bright, articulate, and brave. But identity isn't meant to be performed for an audience. By her 20s, Jazz began speaking openly about the cost of that pressure. She admitted to feeling emotionally lost, sexually disconnected, and unsure of who she truly was. "I feel like I don't even know who I am anymore," she confessed in one scene. That line alone should have stopped the world in its tracks. Her journey is not an argument against gender transition. It is a cautionary tale about what happens when a young person's life becomes a battleground for ideology, when the need for a success story outweighs the need for that person's mental and emotional well-being. In 2024, Jazz Jennings continues to update her fans through social media, openly discussing mental health, self-discovery, and her efforts to rebuild her life. She is working on losing weight, regaining confidence, and finding peace. The cameras are quieter now, the headlines less frequent, and perhaps for the first time in her life, Jazz is just a young woman trying to figure out what it means to truly be herself. And maybe that is the most important part of her story, the part that reminds us that progress is not a straight line, that healing takes time, and that every individual deserves the freedom to grow, stumble, and rise without the world watching their every move.